I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1801 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode today, I have an incredibly special guest. Her name is Tracy Himes. She is in the process of writing a book about her brother who served in the Vietnam War and none other than the Blue Max, 2nd of the 20th in the 1st Cav Division. Title of her book is War and Pennies. Now, if you think that is a strange title like I did, as soon as she tells you about it, you will be able to understand why she named her book War and Pennies. Without any further ado, Tracy Himes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. I know you normally have generals and veterans and a lot of military dignitaries on this podcast, so I'm just honored and really grateful to be a part of it. So thank you for having me.
Well, the honor is mutual. I really appreciate you coming on here to talk about this book because when I heard about it, I said, this is a book that will definitely go on the recommended reading list for this podcast, and I'm so glad you took time out of your busy schedule to come on and tell us about it. Now, as I understand it briefly, you found some letters that your brother had written during the Vietnam War, and they were so touching and compelling, you decided to write a book about it, and this writing process has taken you down a very interesting path. First of all, tell us a little bit about the relationship between you and your brother and what led to this book.
I'd love to. My brother was about 14 years older than me. So when he left to enlist in the Army, he was 17 years old. He dropped out of high school and he enlisted to join the Army. I was 4. And so he promised to send me goodies in his mail packages and letters, and he went off to war. And, of course, I was between 4 and 6 while he was gone, but we had a very close relationship, probably as close as anybody was, he and I, even with the age difference. Our relationship was amazing up until the day he passed away, which was in 2000. 20 years ago, I was handed these letters. I didn't know anything about them. My mother had kept them for all those years. I guess that was 35 years after he wrote them or so. They were in pristine condition. They were a mass amount of communication, and it was astonishing to me. My brother, like many veterans, didn't talk about the war after it. He did survive the war, thank goodness. He wrote volumes of words during the war. I was surprised because after the war, he spoke so few words, even though he lived to be in his 50s. It was an amazing feat to have spent so much time writing when he was he was at the height of the war, and he was in a place, in a job that stayed extremely busy in Vietnam. As you know, the 1st Cav and their reputation.
When was he over there in Vietnam?
He was there he first went to Fort Rucker in January of 1967, and then he went Fort Dix and then Fort Rucker. He went to the aviation school down there, and he really wanted to be a pilot, but he said, I wasn't smart enough to be a pilot, so they made me a door gunner. They really made him a crew chief. He stepped foot in Vietnam on August 5th of 1967. And then he was there and wrote until the following year of August 5th of 1968. He wrote letters for 12 months. He re-enlisted and never wrote another letter from his second tour.
Was he over there for 2 complete tours, or he just extended on his first tour?
He extended on his first tour, so it was 18 months.
Now, was he with the 2nd of the 20th Blue Max the whole time?
Yes.
Was he a door gunner and crew chief the whole time there with the 2nd of the 20th?
Yeah, he was assigned the role of crew chief when he couldn't make the pilot role. And I guess at some point as a crew chief, you have to play door gunner. Like, you can't always get a door gunner to sit beside you. So when you don't have one, you become the door gunner. But maybe both the guys in the back seat play door gunner. I don't know. But yes, he had an M16 strapped to him at all times for a solid year. Even when he was on the ground, he kept it on, and most often, he said. And then, rockets underneath his feet, because he was in the aerial rocket artillery, and you know a little bit about that, I think.
Oh, yes, and I would also say that if he was a door gunner with the 2nd of the 20th for 18 months, he probably got to see a lot of action.
An incredible amount of action. At the height of the war, C-768, it didn't get any more intense than that.
Did he make it through unscathed, or was he ever wounded?
He received a couple of Purple Hearts, but he didn't want to accept them because they were from shrapnel and flying rocket caps and that sort of thing. So relatively unscathed, yes, compared to his comrades. He obviously came out, well, not obviously, he sadly came out with quite a bit of trauma that was never really addressed or diagnosed. But yes, he went through quite a number of pretty famous battles and experienced a lot of things, some of which he wrote about and some of which I discovered along the way, that there's no way that he couldn't have been traumatized by that. And he came home, and he was welcomed home with a giant welcome sign on the side of our house. I'll have to show you that picture. It's amazing. The paper got a hold of it and everything. So he was welcomed home. And in the end, that's, the good part of the story. But that jungle followed him, Mac. That jungle followed him home. And it infiltrated our house and our family.
He did get married and have a family of his own?
He did. He has a wonderful love story in the end.
You mentioned this earlier. Go ahead and tell us how he met his love of his life.
It's kind of the end of the book, and it's the happy part of the book, right? The theme of the book really is more about love than it is war, and there's a lot of war in his letters, obviously, but he writes an incredible, heartfelt truth about what it's like to be in the backseat of a Huey for almost every single day. I mean, those guys work their butts off. He had a girlfriend back home, and he talked a lot about things that boys at 18 would talk about, drinking and girls and fast cars. He talked a lot about the car he wanted. And so when he came home, it was bittersweet. His girlfriend ditched him, so he didn't have the love of her that he planned to marry, but the car was sitting in the driveway. So a Dodge Charger, brand new, Hemi engine, bucket seats, leather, everything he asked for. So he got the car, and a couple months later, he got the girl. He walked into a bar, met my dad to play some pool, and locked eyes with Marlene, and they were married 10 days later.
Love at first sight. Oh.
And she has never remarried, and they were together until he passed. So, yeah.
So he came home, got married, had a family, and how about work? What did he do as a profession?
He was a mechanic all his life. He had a reputation for always having an engine in the dining room. We always, when we go to visit him, he would be teaching his kids. He's got 2 daughters and a son, and the son was the last one. I remember those girls, they learned how to do stuff with engines that I never could imagine learning. He was just really good with mechanics. And I guess as a crew chief, you have to check every bolt and every screw and make sure everything's right. It's a little less about mechanics, but that's where his passion for that subject obviously came from. He was a really well-respected crew chief. But he also was kind of a mischief rebel in the war, and I found some really fun things in his letters that I couldn't believe he was telling my mom, but about some of his little boy's antics. And he stole the Jeep from the major one night, didn't tell anybody where he was going, and him and his buddy drove from their landing zone all the way to Camp Evans and back. And on the way back, they ran out of gas. So here, they're in the middle of the jungle. Nobody knows where they are. They run out of gas, and they're both like, okay, we're screwed. We're dead. Any minute now, the enemy's going to come get us. And then they found a gas can in the back of the Jeep. So saved their butt.
That could have easily happened up there at Camp Evans. I'm familiar with that place.
I bet you are.
He came home, got married, had a family, continued in this job as maintenance or vehicles. He sounds like he's another one of those tremendous representatives of that Vietnam veteran generation that I always talk about. That is one that is as great as any that ever heeded the call of duty from its country. And I'll bet when he came back home, you said he spent his time after Vietnam in the New Jersey area?
Yes, stayed in New Jersey. Our family was originally from the South in North Carolina, so he's kind of a Southern boy that grew up in New Jersey.
I'll bet he did a better job up there because of his experiences in Vietnam. And I'm curious about these letters now. He went to Vietnam, he came home, had the family and a profession. You said he passed away in 2000, so that was 20 years ago. When exactly did you come in possession of these 99 letters?
Once he died, and my mother and sister-in-law were going through some things. I don't know who had preserved them, but they were in a box, preserved, wrapped together in a rubber band. They gave them to me, and they said, you might want to read these. They know that I'm kind of the family historian, and I like to keep things like that. And so I was amazed when I found them because, again, there's way more words in those letters than I ever heard him speak in 30 years.
When in the process of reading these letters did you decide you've got to put them down in a book?
What a great question. It took me quite a while to finish reading all of them. It was because I started reading them and I realized how amazing they were. And so then I went through this long process, literally years, Mac, probably 2 to 3, 4 years, where I would just pick it up every now and then and add to a database. I would put them in the database, and every letter I would number, put the date where he was, if I could figure it out, any proper nouns and names and places and highlights and lowlights. Then I started researching some of these places and what happened at war and what did he mean when he said, if they just let us fight this war the way we wanted to, it would already be over. He would say things like that, and I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know that much about Vietnam. I mean, just what I'd heard, as a young child, and since then. I read things that I never believed my brother would say or feel.
Did he ever talk about fighting with one hand tied behind our backs?
Not literally. He said that there were times when they were shot at, and they couldn't shoot back.
That's exactly what I was saying. Our hands were tied behind our back. But anyway.
Yes, that's exactly it.
One thing that I really want you to tell us about. I can see it now. You've got these letters, and they must have been tremendous letters. The title of the book, War and Pennies, where did that come from?
So, titles are so hard to come by, and it took me a long time to discover what this book really was about. But he sent home letters that had a lot of war in them, but they also literally had pennies in them. He sent me pennies, his little sister, from Fort Dix and Fort Rucker. He sent me pennies and money for my piggy bank. And he said we could bet every penny he was going to come home safe. And in every letter, he talked about promising to come home safe. I'm fine, I'm well, I'm going to be home in X number of days. When he was in Vietnam, he had his best friend of his whole life he found right there in the crew chief tent. And I found this soldier which is part of the discovery phase of this whole story. And his name is Rich. And Rich told me that Larry searched and scoured the ground everywhere they went looking for pennies. Because he realized once he got to Vietnam, it was going to be really hard to find me pennies. And he had promised to send me pennies. And at one point, my piggy bank was stolen, and he wrote about that. These pennies kind of took on a whole different life while he was gone to Vietnam. And also when I was writing this book, they kind of each, in my mind, represent now the soldiers that I've learned about that perished that he knew, the stories that I've discovered through his best friend and other people that I've found and met and interviewed. It's kind of like the penny in my mind now represents every soldier. And pennies are thrown away these days, and they're left on the ground, and people don't pick them up, and they don't think there's value in them. And they just feel to me like the aging veterans that are homeless or sad in their house and can't talk about this experience because they've been forgotten and they weren't welcome. And so the pennies have really morphed from, my brother sending them to me, which is sweet sentiment, and it was a great memory, and a collection that I cherished as a child, to really what this book is about and the theme of the book and sort of the outcome of my research for the book.
Did he send you pennies from Vietnam too? To get the answer to that question, you're going to have to come back and listen to episode 1802, because I'm cutting it off here and Tracy will continue her story in the next episode. I had to cut it off because I hear the dogs a-barking. The boys are coming over and we're getting ready to go out to do a little coon hunting tonight. They are all loaded up with old number 7 Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. We got the shotguns and the dogs, and we're headed out. Can't miss that. And by the way, we're not going to go out and shoot the coons. We only go out because we love to hear the symphony of the dogs barking when they tree one of those coons. We give the coon the option of escaping. I do encourage you to come back and listen to episode 1802, where Tracy Himes continues to explain her tremendous book that is titled War and Pennies. It was inspired by the 99 letters that her older brother wrote from Vietnam while he was serving with the Blue Mac, 2nd of the 20th ARA in the 1st Cav Division. The book will soon be published. From what she has told me, it's going to be a wonderful book. It will be on the recommended reading list for this podcast. I encourage you to go over to the podcast website, Vietnam Veteran News. Check out episode 1801, and there you will see a picture of Tracy herself. She speaks across the nation on behalf of not only her brother, but all Vietnam veterans. Make sure you hear the rest of her story in episode 1802 of this podcast. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1801 of the podcast. I thank you very much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?